So I'm a Jesuit priest of the Northeast Province, and taught for 15 years after I did my doctorate at Emory University in Atlanta, and then taught at Boston College, a Jesuit university, for 15 years. And when the opportunity to take this chair in Catholic theology at Vanderbilt came up, I spoke to my provincial superior and said, "You've been exhorting us to think outside the box and, go where we're not, and that sort of thing, and Boston College is all very established, Jesuit place. And there were no Jesuits in Tennessee, and so he's like, yeah, if you were offered that, I'd commission you there, you could take it, yeah. So I ended up in Nashville 8 years ago, and I've begun my 9th year now in the faculty. And in the second of those years was when we admitted him to our doctoral program, the one student we brought that year. Very selective, and it's been a joy. I'm very grateful, and to connect with Portia again, and then to meet Louisa, and to meet all of you. A little bit of an overview might be in order, and then to let you know that in my scheme of things for this evening, tomorrow morning, which will be a lengthier block of time, and then there'll be like an hour after lunch, I think, tomorrow, trying to plan it out, think it through. The talks, I'm hoping, will be self-contained enough to work whether people are coming or going. And also, I wanted to say at the beginning that what I'll do tonight is a rather formal talk. I'll be reading from a text. Tomorrow, at least for the first half of the morning, I'll be working from an outline, more of my just teacher mode, that sort of thing. But I will try as best I can to keep my finger on the pulse of the room, and if it's not working or something, just let me know, okay? Because I'd hate to have you sit here and not be benefiting. Liturgy and ethics, it's true. It's a topic that I got engaged in my graduate studies at Emory. And my degree is in systematic theology, but with this focus toward liturgy and sacraments. And I've discovered over all these years, I did that degree from 91 to 96, and that's quite a while ago now. And ever since in my career, constantly people keep saying, well, this is a new topic, or this is an edgy topic. And for this first talk tonight, I put a few terms on the board. I'll hit them somehow, and then we can discuss or review them. But on that first point, I hope you don't mind all these self-introductory comments, but it may help. One of my other degrees is in cultural anthropology. And in fact, I did an anthropology degree at the advice of my undergrad professor, who was a great sacramental theologian. So if you want to be on the cutting edge of this, do that first, and then do the theological doctorate, you see. And so I'm using a bit here first some not theological language, but social scientific language, the work of anthropologists and social psychologists who did a certain project. But it's a continuum. I've got an arrow going back and forth here, like this could be sliding along a scale. But what's going on with this is the notion, two terms by these anthropologists, so they're very specific. And one is ritual, other is sincerity. And I put it in quotes because it might not be the way we think of the word sincerity, like off the top of our heads, Are you being sincere? What's the antinomy of being sincere? I guess it'd be that you're being deceptive, something like that. Deceiving, lying, I don't know. But in this kind of range, what these social scientists are trying to describe, or these anthropologists, is to describe a continuum of way we humans go about being human. And it's a range, it's a scale. These are not exclusive, right? It's sort of, these two flow into each other. But one is their term ritual. Lots of and for Christians, Christian ritual we call liturgy or sacramental rites. That ritual is that kind of human activity we do that is quite structured, right? And also that very often takes us or steps us out of our ordinary ways of proceeding and using our time, and instead pauses all that. And we do these other gestures, words, it can be anything, right, involved symbolically in ritual activity, that in a sense puts all the busyness of life on hold to do this thing. It can be as simple as, you might not think of it this way, but these theorists help us, as simple as shaking hands. In that, it's not, when you think about getting something practically done, right? It doesn't overtly or obviously serve any purpose if you want to be that way about it, right? We need to get X, Y, or Z done today, and we're a bunch of volunteers who've shown up on this site, and wouldn't just, well, here's your, it's a Habitat for Humanity build site, right? You know, and what are you good at? And you like to paint, do you? And this one wants to hammer. And just get to work, right? What would be the good of, let's say, in our own culture, American culture, maybe doing what we did at the beginning of this class, and to introduce each other, maybe be as simple as first as shaking hands. That's a description. A handshake is a ritual. Because the way this theory works is it isn't essential to getting the practical task done. Now you might say, well, no, I'd like to argue against that because, hey, people won't get the task done as well if they don't feel committed to each other, if they don't feel like they know each other, you know, this sort of thing. So the handshaking ritual might be helpful for the bigger project rather than people being strange. They won't feel as much as strangers, stuff like that. So it starts to slide along this scale, but I hope that, and there'll be other examples that come up, but ritual, Christian ritual, liturgy, it's a kind of activity that we humans do that is very stylized, it's very patterned. It doesn't mean that new styles and new patterns can't emerge, but one of the characteristics is they do emerge, and that this is the way we do it, right? Wherever I go and help out in parishes and so forth, you learn pretty quick not to move any furniture. Right?
Yes.
And a new pastor in a church, at least in the world I run around in, I've heard so often, you know, the smart pastor doesn't touch or change a thing for a year. And you need to build up relationships, but also that's the power of ritual. Now, what is sincerity? At the other end, and this moving scale, again, nothing is ever totally one or the other, you know, that's simply, yeah. But at the other end, the sincerity issue comes more to when the pastor has built this relationship with these people, yeah, such that what is meant by sincere is people explaining themselves, describing themselves, telling the stories, you see. There's a narrative, there's a history. I mean, Eileen, really, I would say by this theory, these theories of the anthropologists, you were engaged in a very sincere exercise. Yes, because you were telling your story, you were telling, you were explaining how it is that you find yourself in the situation that you're in, and in fact, even how you're invested in it, how you're excited about who knows where this future will lead. Okay, that sort of thing. The simple fact is then about this initial concept is that we think very often about our ethical behavior, and for the purpose of this day and a half, what I mean by ethics simply is all the practical ways in which we live our lives with and for each other, right? So ethics isn't just a narrow question, let's say, of in the hospital, what are the biomedical issues about end of life, or you name it, you know, we call that's clearly an ethical question, you know. This word ethics is much broader, and it has to do with, in a way, this notion of sincerity. It has to do with how is it that we're being honest, engaged, or not? How is it that we're going about doing these practical activities and commitments and evaluations that are needed so that, in fact, we're functioning well as a community. The community could be a family, it could be a parish, it could be a town, you know what I'm saying? It's concentric circles. So if one is intrigued, as a couple of you mentioned, by this question of, well, what is liturgy and ethics? That was sort of more of a social scientific angle. But for an overview, the other way to look at it, I would describe as I'm using it drawing directly from a German theologian who's now in his 90s, but a real powerhouse of a thinker. His name is Johann Baptist Metz, but in case you're at all, I mean, if it helps or not, but But this, I think, quite brilliant, priest theologian, helps to do, I think, something of this description in an explicitly Christian framework. And here it goes. His important premise, and I adopt this as well, obviously, it means a lot to me, is that the first thing we need to recognize is that Christianity or Christian faith is not an idea. Christian faith is a praxis. Big fancy word. That's why you're here, right? You want to get the big fancy word. But for Metz, Christian faith isn't an idea, faith isn't an argument, faith isn't a series of propositions or ideas or statements that you memorize and can repeat or explain. That the Christian faith or Christianity is a praxis, which means it is a way of life. Praxis is an ancient Greek philosophical term. You say, well, why don't you just say practice, other than you're behaving like an egg-headed professor? Well, the reason is, it's saying, yes, our lives are practical, but that the word praxis is drawing on the notion of this is reflected upon, such that we reflect upon what it is that we've been doing, we do, but then in the doing, that brings new questions back how to reflect. But having reflected, one now has deeper insights on how to do. You see, it's a movement, right? Back and forth. Fancy language for that in philosophy and stuff is dialectic. This is going to happen. I brought you my ragweed reactions now to cold, dry air. I'm living in two different seasons. So, yeah, that's what's meant by praxis. Christian faith, then, too often in our modern world, and especially, in our modern world of educational systems, of Christianity being allied with educational institutions even, is that you need to know these ideas. Learn your catechism. Can you answer those questions? You see? It's all about ideas and terms. Metz is saying that can be part of it, but only part of it. The most important thing is Christianity is a praxis. It's a reflective way of life. And it's a praxis of, again, these are going to be terms like, whoa, what's going on? It's a praxis of, in his terms, mysticism and social ethics, or ethics. That's what it is. Now, it doesn't quite simply follow what I'm doing here. It doesn't quite simply follow my ritual term right away. You might be like, well, what's going on? But I'm saying that these two things do overlap quite a bit. How? That what he means by a praxis of mysticism and ethics, when I was saying that there's a way in which we do reflective, if you will call it reflective work, reflective activity, that in turn enriches who we are such that the way we engage in these practical, day-to-day ethical matters of our lives, how to live a good life, a just life, how to deal with ourselves and each other, both in terms of what we might call, in our time, our personal morality, but also our social ethical concerns, right? How do these things influence each other? How does it, the very practical issues that we as Christians in, whether it's Europe or here in the United States or Canada, where we have a very clear distinction between church and state, right? So how do we engage in a wider society where we're not going to either very often explicitly invoke our Christianity or try to press it upon others when, with all people of goodwill, we're trying to reach good resolutions for a better social body. How does that relate to what we do, just for example, by being people who faithfully celebrate the Lord's Day together on Sunday morning, and what we do in that hour or hour and a half? Now for Metz, the language mystical, it's for him and some other theologians in Europe as well. I think they did a good job. The word mysticism is that word, not unlike ritual, I was saying, that is the kind of activities that people might objectively say are not productive or practical. Now, you may want to argue with me, but stick with it for a sec. So mysticism would include things like liturgy, which is, of course, people communally giving glory to God for the sanctification of people, for the upbuilding of our own holiness. Liturgy, prayer, which could be also anything from, individual prayer or customs or popular religiosities, as we say. Mysticism would include reflective reading of sacred scripture, the Bible, or other, analogously, even if we don't want to use the word scripture, other sacred texts or other sacred practices, whether forms of meditation, contemplation, entering deeply into a visionary state. All those things are what would come under this broad category of mysticism in relation but in contrast to the kinds of activities I was describing, which are how do we practically get X, Y, or Z done? Or how do I practically learn, or we together learn how to deal with this new situation that, it's not about always just reflecting on high and lofty ideas. It's much more about how are we going to get this funded? How are we going to notice, and we finally, thank God, have come to notice this group of marginalized people, or how are we going to adapt to an aging population? Any of these practical questions are, broadly speaking, ethical questions. Does that make sense? And in that sense, there's some of them I just mentioned are more social ethical. But our ethics, as I was trying to say, also entails, right down to the nitty-gritty, entails just all the practical decisions and actions we're doing during our regular workaday or family or you name it, life. And it kind of moves again between the scale. They're mutually impacting, but you can't simply claim one is the other. Does that make sense? So one of the things that became contentious some decades back, at least in the American Roman Catholic context in which I've lived all my life, but I think back to the 70s or 80s, there were moments where people were very upset about relevance and practicality. So these liturgies, these sacraments, these Sunday liturgy, let's say, it's a waste of time. It doesn't produce any results. Do you start to hear the difference, you see, between this mystical versus this practical, ethical activity? So let's do rather than, it might just be a reflection on the quality of the preacher, but rather than having, whatever these sermons and homilies are like, let's get a speaker in here to talk about water rights, or I don't know, you pick an issue, is that okay? And the argument from the position I take along with these greater minds that I learn from is that that's a bit of what I would call a category mistake. That there's a great value in the doing of ritual activity, as these anthropologists say, that in its own right, it has its own integrity. And even in the doing of it, even in that process in which we can't just shut our brains off and not be aware on a given Sunday, let's say, if there's really an urgent issue. That doesn't just poof, leave our heads, right? One of the challenges for people as they preach homilies on Sunday, or any other day, but I mean on Sunday, is going to be how do you make this Word of God come to life such that it speaks to and listens to a lot of what's practically happening in our lives. And yet, there's something unique about doing it with the Word of God proclaimed that's very different than simply holding a meeting about it. Does that make sense? So this first big concept that I hope will help us for what I'll do a little bit now in a more formal lecture, and leading into tomorrow as well, morning and short little thing in the afternoon, is, in one sense, that's one of the big, broad brushstrokes description of this. a title like Liturgy and Ethics, well, that's, in a sense, this mysticism in ethics, or this very important human ritual activity, and then having to, in their terms, sincerity, meaning argue, explain, work out, tell, recount, result kind of activity. And the question becoming again, there are two distinct types of activity, even though they're related, and it can be a mistake often for people, or things can get gummed up in a given social group or community if one starts to get collapsed too much into the other. Yeah? All right, now that may have been way up at 10,000 feet, I don't know. But before I kind of jump in a little bit further, is there anything, you don't have to, but comment, question, all good? Yeah?
Could you give an example of how sincerity could get collapsed into ritual?
Yeah, thank you. It was what I was weakly, obviously, weak attempt to describe, for example, if people decided, and this happened in places back a few decades ago, it doesn't make any sense anymore. For example, at a certain seminary in New York City, it didn't happen to be a Catholic one, the other example was my own Catholic background, but this seminary in the 1970s decided to put a moratorium on their daily chapel services. We are no longer going to do what was the regular pattern of 45 minutes a day in the schedule is to assemble in this chapel and to do, I guess, I'm going to extrapolate a bit. But let's say we're going to do Eucharist one day a week, we're going to have other sorts of forms of prayer these other days, etc. Why not? Because there's so much urgency in our society right now in the arms race and with the Vietnam War going on, this was the 70s, etc., that rather than, we're simply annulling any kind of worship service. And we're going to spend that time working on a protest movement or working on a new letter writing campaign, or, you see, those kinds of things.
So does that kill mysticism?
Yeah, that would be the argument. What it does certainly is it annuls it, it cancels it. I don't know if it kills it, but what it does say is that in that scenario, as I've read about it, it was one in which they were saying there is nothing practical, and in fact we think it's immoral for us to waste our time, 45 minutes a day, 5 days a week, doing this traditional, these worship services in our chapel.
So then mysticism feeds the other.
Yeah, and the other can feed the mysticism.
Oh, okay.
It's got to go both ways.
So
that's why I'm trying to do this arrow, the back and forth.
Oh, okay.
In the anthropologist language, it would be ritual sincerity. And sincerity, again, just means this is how we are trying not just to do ritual activity that steps out of the usual patterns, practical patterns of life. Sincerity is where you're trying to now not do something simply that in its repetitiveness, in its getting into our bones, to speak metaphorically. It's not only metaphorical, actually, right? Into our bodies. The sincere much more is about explaining, arguing, action plan, evaluation. You see, how are we going to protest at this point in 1973 America's involvement in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia? That was their issue.
So would an example be that the current political situation that we have is too strong on ritual, too strong on in the integrity of ritual? No, it isn't strong enough on mysticism.
Gotcha.
Let's put it that way.
Right.
Yeah.
In that scenario, that would be the argument.
Okay.
From other critics, would be to say, yeah, but what do you lose when all of a sudden you are no longer in any way engaging together in these explicit symbols and words of your Christian faith
Okay.
at that seminary?
Okay.
What, have you in fact, this would be the argument, not squandered some very real treasures and resources? Again, tradition isn't supposed to be a moppy closet, right? It's got to be something living and active. But still, what do you lose when you no longer are a people of prayer? What do we lose when all we think now is kind of a cold pragmatism? Might there be a problem that this can make us rigid? Might it be that we're not going to notice or listen or even be open to possibilities that we might otherwise be pliable to, we might otherwise be open to, if in fact we're also doing this other type of activity? Give you another example. It's an interesting one. In that same period, now it sounds like, the 70s must have been hell on earth or something. But another example of the pragmatic in a Christian community, there was a monastery of monks, Roman Catholic monks, in France, who likewise caught this bug, if you will. I'm just speaking sort of lightly. And they decided that they were Trappists. They were that strict version of Benedictine, and so they should be doing the Liturgy of the Hours 7 times a day, starting at 3 in the morning, right? And the last one's at 8 p.m. But all through the day, it's peppered with, back to chapel you go, and while you're doing your other work, yeah? And the abbot, and I guess maybe his little leadership council, decided again, a lot of this is a waste of time. And they were using, this is the early 70s, so it was just after the Second Vatican Council, they were still using the chant lines that they had been singing for centuries. It's a true story. They chucked it, all of it. It was this kind of moment where at least the leadership core decided this is not, it doesn't accomplish anything, right? By very pragmatic, practical, get results, evaluate. And so this they did. They stopped chanting at all. They even changed. They had a very strictly kind of a vegetarian diet. And they decided, the heck with that, we'll just eat, more like other people and so forth. And over a couple of years, they ended up all being rather listless, sick, and there was a lot of tension in the place. But they were most wondering, why was it that one by one they were just turning into people, men, that the key thing was had no energy. And so they got this guy, a particular doctor, who specialized, someone somehow hooked them up with this doctor, whose research and specialty had everything to do with our entire ocular system, how the ear works, and works in relation to the whole body. And he interviewed, he found out what I just rehearsed, that they had simply completely annulled what in this description would be all of their regular ritual, liturgical, mystical activity. Now the idea was, you may, I suppose it was your monks, well, you figure out how to pray. You figure out your sincerity. You figure out in each of your own unique ways how you're going to pray. But it turned out they couldn't pray at all. They were all just kind of depressed and sort of slouched around. And what he did, because of his specialty, when he found out, he said, well, wait a minute, you stopped chanting, and in fact, in this case, in that culture, Gregorian chant is a remarkable thing, especially when it's done in the way they built a lot of those monastic buildings. There's a kind of resonance that happens in the room and so forth. And he said, well, all of those things affect your body as well as your mind and your spirit. We start to get away from, in this very modern way, of splintering out what's a body issue, what's a mind issue, what's a spirit issue, duh. But this has been one of the curses of modernity, thinking that these things are separate. So he got them back. He said, Father Abbott, you've blown it. I think you made a huge mistake, and let's just, dust off your choir stalls and let's get going. And sure enough, over a many months period of time, by getting back to going to the chapel and chanting and so forth, they got back into kind of regular form.
So what I'm hearing is that both are important for the whole creature that we are.
Couldn't say it better.
Okay.
And not only the creature that each of us is in our own body, but notice in the story it also affected the social body of the community, right? So another concept that I like to point out that really is important as we move through these kind of questions is to get away from the modern notion, this comes really with modern philosophy from the late 1700s forward. It's a trajectory that develops, okay? That starts to really separate out the mind and the body and the individual from the communal. The idea starts to become every individual human being should, and I'm going to use just the male pronoun because this is how these professors in these universities thought, and yeah, it's all just about men, right? So each man should be able to figure out for himself his autonomous identity, his goals, his abilities, in a sense, be a self-made man, if that makes sense. And such thinking, if taken to the extreme practically, ends up with people not recognizing how integrated, like in the story you were just, really getting the point at, people start to lose the recognition that in fact, the only way we even think, the only way in which we even have a spiritual life is bodily, right? It's something I often like to think about. It's all happening because I got a brain, and however mysterious the brain is, the mind, in conjunction with even more mysterious, to me at least, the spirit, the fact is they're only happening because of the physicality of my body. So, a French theologian, whole different French story, okay, whom I've studied a lot and worked with, written about, came up with among several of his key points in sacramental liturgical theology, and he's very interested in this relation to our practical ethical lives. This point that each one of us is what he calls, this is the first person pronoun, singular, I, I am Bruce, okay. The I body. The problem in my journey was so often to think that somehow the I floats, and somehow the body is just a vehicle to deliver, my mind, or deliver my ideas, you see. But he's saying, no. This is quite inseparable. Who I am in my own mind and my own spirit, who I am, is inextricably tied in, completely knitted to my bodiliness, my physical bodiliness, the I body. So he's not reducing us to mere material, but he's saying we have to recognize the materiality and the spiritual and intellectual, or the mind, all of this is of this operative whole. But we never, each of us, operate as a whole alone. So we belong to what he says, the human body is a triple body. What does he mean? The human body is three things. Okay, so beautiful chalkboards, now I'm just going to go crazy, and you can follow it. The triple body, he says, is physical, social, and traditional. That the way in which we go about being human in our bodiliness, when we think the word body, he says, it's not reducible to any one of these things. It's all of these things happening concurrently. And the idea is to talk about them intellectually like in a class or a book. What are we doing? We're analyzing. And all that word means from its Latin roots is we're breaking something down to understand it. While the trick is to keep remembering in the back of our mind, actually it's a synthesis. All of this is always, in real life, all happening at once, you see? But we step away from it and we try to break it down into parts to understand it. Then we've got to always keep returning to the recognition that, oh, well, now, wait a minute, no. But all of that's happening at the same, it's all of a mix, yeah? So he says, well, we think body so often, especially in our modern times, we think all we're talking about with the body is the physical body. This is my body. This is a 60-year-old version of it. And think of the physical body, he says, not only, though, as our physical bodies, but also our bodies under the same category are cosmic. That our bodies are part of a physical cosmos or world or universe, right? That our bodies both participate in, contribute to, for good or bad, but also are affected by all the movements in this cosmos, world, universe. People are affected by moons, are affected by tides. You start to get it? So when he says physical, even still, the danger can be people think, well, then I'm just talking about this, But actually, my physicality is part of a larger physical, right? So that I'm scratchy-throated because of ragweed, just to be very self-indulgent here. But also, like I say, we can be in many ways, affected by our environment and affecting our environment, right? So the physicality, think of it both as our own bodies, but our bodies as part of a larger physical cosmos. So when he says each of us is an I body, a person with a personality, a spirit, a mind, and a physical, he says this bodiliness is irreducibly physical, but also, second category, social. Our bodiliness is social. That, in fact, we humans, and heaven knows there are lots of other creatures, whether mammals especially, certain like dogs, are quite social in the way that they operate and function in relation to others and so forth. But we human beings are social. Or you could say the body is social or the body is cultural. Again, there's some synonyms here, okay? Range of words. Sometimes people distinguish between social and cultural. How do they do that? Well, they want to say social has to do with all the ways in which a group of people govern and organize and regulate themselves. That's society. And it's necessary, right? Both so that people can get what they need and hopefully flourish, but also to prevent all sorts of abuse or mistreatment or unjust distribution of what's needed among this group of people. Social. And they say, okay, but the cultural has to do with how it is that we deport ourselves in our family life, in our, they would say in these social scientific ways, religious life, ethnic heritages, you name it. I mean, an example of how our bodiliness is social/cultural, which is very contested now in our American context, has to do with gender and gender identity. So the conventional thing, the social custom is, for me, to be wearing a pair of trousers and a shirt. I just, this summer, sound very self-indulgent, but I was in Scotland for a couple of weeks for both business and pleasure, and then on to Durham, England, which is near Scotland for academic work too. But I'm always it's quite something to be in a place where with some regularity you see men wearing kilts, right? But that's a socially constructed body, right? That isn't here in Nashville or I would argue in South Dakota. There might be Scottish people who do this and carry it on, and it can even carry over then into what he calls the traditional. So why not, if one is from Scottish ancestry or even as a Scot who moves to the US of A, for example, why not just leave the kilts back in Scotland? What's going on with this? And what's going on with it is a deep sense of tradition. Tradition, in a sense, I like to think of it as a subcategory of social and culture, right? But I like to describe tradition in my most pithy definition is tradition is simply anything in which people say, that's how it's always been. And we often do that with each other. Don't transgress or change this or that of our social cultural patterns, which may even be written on our bodies in our physical appearance, like our clothing. Why? What's the big deal? Or again, in sincerity, I want to express my unique self, or whatever. Well, it's because the body is also traditional. And in our own modern and late modern times, this again is something that's changing and being contested and challenged. Huh?
So if we throw away our kilts, so to speak, we throw away something that's important to not only myself but to humanity in general.
Or maybe at least this traditional body to which I belong.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you want to remember that social bodies can be a social unit, could be a family, could be a couple, could be a mother and child. I mean, it depends, right? But a social body might be the McGregor clan. I'm just pulling it out of my paternal grandmother was Scott, the Cahoon clan, if you will. And that's a social body with a tradition. It's a traditional body as well as a social body.
So why does this harm us?
Well, that's a good question. Anybody want to?
What's the question?
The question is, why does that harm us? Who cares if you just chuck the tradition and chuck the kilts?
Or genuflecting, or any number of things that
What do you
that
lose?
are age old.
Yeah, what? Age old. Good word for tradition. You guys, go ahead.
In the first parish in which I served, it was a 60s parish. The building was multi-use. So we had parties there, we had church there, we had
Potluck suppers or
stuff like that, yeah. And even there was a point where somebody set up a bar, and that was not good. That was one step too far.
some line got crossed or
Yes. But what I experienced was that there was a loss of transcendence and a loss of enchantment, I guess, Bruno Bettelheim or whatever. And it got flat. In fact, it was flat enough so when the liturgy committee got together, it was always, let's do something new. And if you wanted to do what we did last year, oh no, we did that last year. And it became an entirely different thing. Now there were some people who were deeply spiritual in the parish. But the emphasis was definitely on social action. And that was what the church was about. And I found that it left something flat. It was like the air had come out or something like that. And so I was happy to leave it behind. But that was formed in reaction to the parish out of which they came was very traditional, almost to the point of being military. A lot of military people. It was in DC suburbs. So that was written into who they were.
Mm-hmm.
Part of their tradition is, we're not that. Of course, that was also a reaction to the Vietnam War and things like that.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it didn't last.
Right.
It lost a lot.
Yeah.
And they kept it going by, let's do something new.
Right.
It's like exciting, whatever.
It helps you at all with what I've been trying to do with you theoretically. What you just described when they say we have to make it new each time, that's what the anthropologists mean by sincerity. That in this polarized situation, often in modernity, they'll say ritual is this repetitious stuff. What's the good of it? Unless it's something that we have, with our own ingenious ways, created out of nothing, new, forget it. It's an extreme point. But in your question of, well, what are we losing when we lose this? I think that's an example. You said, in a sense, it sounds to me like it's a pretty grim situation. Everything is deadly serious, and not completely. I guess if they're setting a bar up.
There's some frivolity and partying going on.
Okay, got to that too. All right, I don't need to bilk it any further. You've spoken very well. Let's just keep some other input and then see how your own reactions are. Yeah, is it Tom?
Yes. I think tradition synonyms might be connection and continuity.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you draw upon previous generations and the value that brought you to that certain point.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a lot of respect in that, and that gives you a foundation and even permission to move to a different place.
Yeah.
That's my take on tradition.
Judy?
I was really grossed out when somebody in the 60s used Coke and potato chips for communion. And that would be an example of not being a ritual, but trying to be contemporary.
Yeah. I heard about, I didn't experience, but before I got to the college that I went to in the late 70s, earlier in the 70s, one of the priests was doing pizza and beer mass. So what's going on in that? You know, there's a question.
It seems to me it's you know, the history of the church I read in one of my books was prophecy and order. So the prophecy pops up, the newness pops up, and St. Francis is a perfect example. And the church says, "Oh no, not that," and then pretty soon they just sort of put it into the order and get it back into the thing and get
Yeah.
the thing back in order. And there is a between generations. There's a quality of suffocating sometimes.
Yeah.
And so that reactivity is part of it.
In a sense, I think I hear in some of this description many things now, but on that point, remember, if you don't mind, if I'm reminding us again, I'm trying to talk about these things being on a continuum. And so again, if it becomes so ritualized, you used the word 5 minutes ago, militaristic in some of the ritual, that can just squelch everything, I guess, you see? On the other hand, if everything's going to become, let's come up with something new, that's actually very hard to sustain together. And so in fact, we as humans, I mean, it's not just we humans. I mean, it's true of mammals, it's true of birds. There's a lot of ritual, pattern behaviors that, in fact, they become like, if any of you, I happen to be a musician, these become the things in your muscle memory that nonetheless are like your go-to language of foundation. They're your foundation that even when you're slipping or falling, you can just automatically do that one. Does that make sense? Why buck that, right? Now, the other extreme is if it becomes so smothering or rigid that the young, the prophetic, the whatever that needs to break in can't, well, that's a problem. But Francis of Assisi, it's a great example. Nonetheless, he did. This did break in. And a group of followers, and Claire also with the women, and they get this whole thing going, and it's true. The patterns in religions, not just Christianity, is such movements tend to become, again, bounded back into the larger structure. But the structure isn't the same, right? The structure has been changed, and it has new elements in it.
Is it a matter of balance then?
It's both and.
Okay.
So back to my point about when we think about our ethical lives, our trying to construct community life, and what is the role of sacraments, liturgy, the mystical, broadly, it's a praxis of both this and this. I might have done a better job if I had done the arrow again, which I did here. It's a movement between these.
Okay.
It's like, if you'll put up with this jargon, it's a continuum. It's not two things that are completely opposite and unrelated, but they are distinct. They have their own specific qualities. And yet, you move between, you do both, you move between them, and in fact, we bring a different, metaphorically speaking, a different spirit, a different perspective, perhaps, to the practical, given perhaps our practice of the traditional, the mystical, the sacramental. And in the same way, some of our cultural and social issues of the day, it may be changing physical situations, either of our environment, we're in this whole, I think for the rest of our lives, right, this whole climate change scenario, for example. In the 1980s, when I was doing this anthropology degree in New York City, it was HIV and AIDS. I mean, it was just ravaging thousands of people, right, in in the city, and having that was a real bodily impact. So all of these, any of these dimensions of our bodiliness as human beings, any one of them in some particular scenarios might be more heightened, critical, endangered, or strong and leading and empowering. My only hope is that with you, that this kind of theorizing might help when we're in practical pastoral situations. Sometime we try to get a little grip on what's going on. Your story, in a sense, rehearses, in retrospect, what was going on in terms of people not wanting to be nailed into too tight a traditionalism. And that, in fact, they want to come up with new forms of sociality and culture. And it's fascinating to think about, why is setting up a bar for some of these occasions an unacceptable thing to do in the same space in which you celebrate Sunday liturgy? Yeah, so, but it had that effect, right? So it's like, look, we can't delude ourselves and not think this matters, right? People are getting ticked off or whatever. And so we're going to have to try to get a sense of, in these different dimensions of how we live together as community and as church, which thing right now has taken the lead? Which thing might be out of kilter compared to the other? So it's a
Saying
big...
thee and thou.
Pardon?
Saying thee and thou instead of...
There's a question. Language. You want to get it going in liturgy and sacraments in any given church, take it from a Roman Catholic. We've been through some real battles in the last 15 years. But the thing is, right, language is another example. To what extent is religious or sacred language, that terminology we often use, right? So if one isn't using a kind of English from a certain era of English history, thee, thou, etc., to pull it back to your point, what's lost? And so, again, one of the tensions in here might be, how does some language that's been dubbed traditional, how is that perhaps not serving in a way the social now, or the culture?
Wow.
It's hard work, but it's
Yeah.
better to at least be able to identify what's going on, right? Because being able to identify what's going on also can, if nothing else in my life at least, it can cut back on the stress, and I'm a real stress bunny. Okay, so it cuts back on the stress because at least you don't feel like you're in a fog or you're at sea or what the heck. At least if one can start to look at these things a little bit with these categories, then one can say, well, okay, I think what do you think? But I think we're in a situation in which ... Maybe they're generational reactions. Younger people, maybe who were not raised in church traditions or cultures by their parents, now, their baby boomer parents, or maybe, I guess we're going to soon have these Gen X parents with kids of that age, but they're saying, you were doing all this 60s and 70s stuff. And, what's the point of it? We can do everything so why do you need the God stuff at all? And I discover each story would have to be told, sincerely, but they discover, in fact, life isn't going, I want some of this God stuff. I'm just trying to paraphrase, okay? And now they want thee and thou. There can be real generational reactions, where it's, this is what we want to do. It's helpful to us. It's empowering. We grapple for words. It's life-giving, and I guess we do have to notice as human beings, in some way, every generation does have to do some slaying of the one before.
In our church now, we're emphasizing a lot of the feminine words concerning God or anything. Yeah, and to me, that seems necessary in our stage of growth in in anything religious or,
Mhm.
or liturgy or whatever it is. But to other people, it can be devastating because it's so not the way it was.
And not just not the way it was, not what they are. It's a great example of not what they are in their ritual activity, just this is what they're attuned to, or this is what
Yeah.
is just the default mode, if you will.
Yeah.
Or this is, when I do ritual, I want that just to be like putting on my slippers. I mean, that's a little bit, I don't mean that to be pejorative, but I'm struggling to find words, which is pretty ridiculous. That's why I also do these very formal texts, I feel this is one there. Right, you're giving an example of this ritual sincerity pole, of this stretch. Because when people say, it's just not right, I can't, every time I hear God referred to as she or her, it makes me cringe, or it's dissonant, or some people might say it makes me angry. I don't know.
Or it ain't real.
Or it isn't really arranged, right? People are, but obviously describing that this is totally not what I expect when I'm in ritual mode. And then, in a sense, a sincere argument has to be generated to explain, well, why? Why are we doing this? Or what would be the value in this? And in some way, some sort of recalibration may or may not happen. And in this other little theoretical frame, it may be that some people can't move off of what they think the tradition is, such that the current social and even physical conditions, the tradition needs to be adapting to it. It's a very delicate dance, but man, I'd like to think, at least for some of us, it sounds like in the room, it's real. This is what happens. It is, you know. The tricky thing is now we're people of a kind of literacy. I want to say a kind of literacy, okay? That is record keeping, bookkeeping, data keeping, textual recounting. That hasn't been the case for a lot of humanity. For most of the time, there's been a humanity. And I'm not going to say it up front. There are pluses and minuses. So I'm not saying, like the poor, benighted primitives, versus, arrived us, enlightened humanity or something. But one of the differences is that without written texts and without historical records and literally minutes of meetings and accounts of events that are written down, rather people share the stories and the narratives of things, and that very storytelling and narrating itself always has very gentle but real morphing and changing and adapting. And so in tradition, even as they say, thus has it always been, it hasn't. And I experienced, I mentioned with a few of you I had the pleasure of having dinner with, for a full year, but then in stints. I've been working with the Yupik Eskimo people in western Alaska, Bering Sea coast Alaska, now since 1981, ever since I got out of college. And it's a great privilege in my life. But one of the things I came to recognize, even a 22, 23-year-old kid that year out of college, living intensely in this one village for a year, they're totally isolated. You're either flown in on a Prof job or that's it, you're there, 600 people. But they were still very much, they were the last village of all of Bering Sea coast Yupik world that still had what was called a men's house, a kazik. And it was built of log and mud. It was quite a structure. And they were still making fire bath in the winter every single night, and then creating and preparing dances for the next potlatch. And some of the elders who constructed the dances got to choose who they would invite to do the dances. And I was very privileged as time went on to be asked to do several and stuff, so I have to go to these rehearsals. And as I sat there, and first of all, I didn't get very far in 10 months' time. Yupik's such a radically different kind of language family. And a lot of the men and women there were either speaking in Yupik or they weren't talking at all. They're not nearly as chatty, if I may put it that way. Which I like, because I'm an introvert. It's like, this is cool, I can sit here for 3 hours, this is fun. And then this dancing is, to me, And but what I learned over that time was, even in that year, I saw a few things morph and change. Very slight. But one of the differences was that one of the song creators and choreographers was a woman. And she was the first woman in Imanok who had ever done this. It was always the men do that. Now, I never picked up that there was some big meeting and discussion over whether Sophie Lee should be allowed to do this. And I don't know at that point in 1981-82 how long or how recent Sophie being a, I'm just using English words, not Yupik, but dance creator had been. But it was unprecedented. Yeah? And but nobody seemed to be upset about it. I wondered, was there a period when they were? Can you imagine with me for a second? But now this is just part of the tradition. And it could be 10 years later that, you know, the current people that are really gifted and putting the time and effort into creating dance, let's say there are 4 or 5 of them, and a couple are women and a couple are men, you know. And it's just not, you know, a discussion. That's one of the factors. I could only know if there were a recorded record or account of that sequence of events. But so often in traditional dimensions of our human bodily living, there aren't. And that's why so often, again, it can be such as it always been, even though it's always been kind of morphing over time. That's harder to do now because of our instant communication and, you know, how much storage we've got on any given computer or cloud, you know, it's called a cloud, isn't it, of storage. We live now, among other things, I'm starting to pontificate, but we live now in a data-driven culture at this step in modernity, right? And so there's just all this information. But in the world of tradition and traditions, what spares tradition from just being a museum, and if that metaphor works, of old stuff, and rather as something that's living and continuing, is it's always being affected by these other dimensions and finding its way. And it could very well, and it probably was very often, some real social conflicts in those traditions that we have no record of, but they actually kind of morphed and changed. You know? But some of those might even happen from the social ethical world, right? That impact back into the mystical, such as what kind of English do we want to use? You know, do you want to use the King's English, to use that phrase, right? Or American English, or you name it. But it's worth noting as an example, if it helps you at all, with what I've been doing with you this evening, it helps you at all. It might help then just to note again that it's a big deal. You know, you can't gainsay the fact, you can't dismiss the fact that the language used in our, let's say, Christian liturgy, our Christian ritual, it's not a light matter at all. Or for some people it would be, they just say, you know what, that's the problem with it. And so let's dump it, and let's just have sincere conversations. You see, that's an extreme reaction.
Which is what's
Things that don't make it, that were, for example, another from the 1960s, a German Catholic theologian named Karl Rahner was writing, brilliant theologian, but writing arguments for why a Eucharist in Japan quite legitimately could be done with rice paper and sake. Well, here's a big problem. It's got to be grape wine, and it's got to be wheat bread, right? This is the deal.
Yeah.
Boom. And in the Roman Catholic Church with our canon law, even it's the matter of the form and all that kind of stuff. But he was trying to make, so not unlike the dirt issue in Guatemala, which I didn't know, this becomes, the language has been for decades, this question of enculturation. How do you take the Christian faith and help it be, take root in the culture where it now is located? Does that make sense? And so Rahner's point was, what sense does it make to impose these food and drink forms that have nothing to do with this culture at all. And people can go from the other side and say, yes, but this story of, if you will, of salvation is very much for Christians rooted in Judaism. And it is the Christian, I would use the language, privilege of becoming people who've been given this gift to continue something based out of that heritage. How much is expendable and not? I'm not solving the question, I'm just trying to show that there are these multiple factors. But ethical questions can come in as well. They really can. A French Jesuit, when I did work my first year in Alaska way back, he's deceased now, but he was pretty much along these lines. He says, I don't understand what sense this makes. He goes, there's no wine in this village. In fact, the villages were by their own statutes that they'd adopted were dry. And it was illegal to bring any kind of alcohol into the villages, with the one exception of for religious purposes. But he said, is there a continuity finally among a people? The Yupiks were really quite isolated until after World War II. It's quite amazing. I saw photos, these elders are dead now, but in my early years of these little black and white photos when they were married, and they're still living outside their mud dugouts and stuff. And it's a fascinating, I just obviously fascinating. But my point would be, his point was, this is not really the food stuff and drink of this culture. And he was coming again from where this elemental, again, think of it, questions about the social body and social and traditional. But the ethical mixes in with it, right? To what extent, I think he was reacting too, to what extent then was it a very overt colonizing effort or imposition to say it must be these things this way? And to what extent can there be an exploration of, it's very difficult, but to try to decide what are the essential elements of this, and then how do they work
Especially when you use scripture.
to boot?
I mean, there's some pretty specific things
Yeah.
about Eucharist
Good example, as well as baptism.
and baptism.
So, you know, the
yes.
very last verse of Matthew's Gospel, for example, right? You know, go
Yeah.
out and baptize all people in the Father, Son, and Spirit, but it's a water baptism, that kind of stuff. So all of these things, again, I didn't want to present them as polarized and exclusive. What I was doing, to give you all, perhaps a few of you, a headache, is to say, I hope it helps to analyze, to break this down into these parts or these terms that might help us in the real life mix of it all, to get a little bit of a ability to get a sense of a given situation of what's going on. And because pastoral life, parish life, community life is of such a nature that these different types of things end up pretty steadily being in tension and sometimes in conflict, I hope, I don't know, it may be helpful to have a few tools at least to try to identify what's in play here. You know, what's going on such that these things are bumping into each other, that sort of thing. And then likewise, the question again about ritual and sincerity, it's also good to keep recognizing that one of the characteristics of ritual over time for people is, like I say, it becomes something that you don't have to argue, explain, or work out, you see. And that for us humans, as well as for other creatures, like I'm saying at least like birds, like mammals, they have ritualized patterns that we can observe, and that is something which somehow sustains life itself. And we shouldn't, the problem can be, I think, in our late modern time is we can think that somehow you can outsmart that, right? And we're smarter than that, and we can get over that, or we can argue our way past that, or explain it, when in fact, no, we can't. And therefore, there can be, again, repeatedly cropping up people's hunger, like I said, for some younger generations who might have been unchurched, and now they very much want maybe church on overdrive. Time has marched on here, and I realize that. But I want to ask, are there other thoughts that you have in mind? Some of us are more introverted than others, and others are, but I am one. But just if you want to collect your thought for a minute. Yes, Judy, and then, yeah. Go ahead, Judy.
I'm still thinking about Eva's situation.
That's a big one.
I was the only person at the Niobrara Convocation that voted against that resolution, and I stated so in the ECW Women's meeting that in the Catholic Church, Deacon Victor Youngbull there handed out communion in the sweat lodge, and that in the Catholic Church, they don't just say, okay, the Guild Hall can have the Native American rituals, but the church built the sanctuary is only for Christian. And I really felt that the whole thing was done way too quickly. I think there was a problem in Cheyenne Butte, as I understand it, and all of a sudden it was imposed on Pine Ridge, who doesn't agree with the resolution, and there are a number of people in Pine Ridge. I can't speak for everybody in Pine Ridge, and I just really felt your input into this as a Roman Catholic was really important to me, because I don't believe we can sit in the place at Convocation. Well, first it was brought up in Niobrara Council, which was a very small number of people compared to 89 or 60 some churches in the Niobrara Deanery. And then a lot of people couldn't afford to go to Convocation because they're too poor to pay for a place to sleep and all that.
Yeah.
And so I really feel the whole thing needs a whole lot more time to talk about it and to discuss it and to figure it out. And I know that's what Bob Tubal's sure expressed at DAS and convention. So anything you want to say about how the Roman Catholic Church respects traditional Native American culture and allows it in the church, not just the Guild Hall.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful, and it's helpful to me.
Oh, thank you.
Bruce, just to put it in context, Niobrara Convocation is the annual gathering of the primarily Native congregations in the diocese.
Okay, got it. Happens once a year.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, we have our own struggles with this, obviously, but there was this effort, certainly since the 1970s, to do much more of what's called inculturation or enculturation. One of the struggles, for example, I can speak from my experience with the Yupik people, was that respect for elders is such a paramount value that the idea of going against the way, by then 3 or 4 generations of Roman Catholic Yupiks had been doing things, was simply unimaginable. So there were people, including some of the priests and sisters working there, who very much were trying to move this along, and do much more of an enculturated version in the liturgy. And in fact, some of the strongest resistance was coming from the pillar leaders of the given village church. Father Fox, it's fascinating, his name is Fox, but he's a French missionary. He made it very clear, you don't do this. Well, Father Fox died in 1940 something, it's 1970. Not the point. This is how this has happened. So all I want to say is that it's been a very uneven and rough ride, but they did reach a point, for example, when they held a meeting of people from all the villages out there at one point, they constructed within the hall of an old church building where they were meeting, a school building where they were meeting, they constructed, and I saw photographs of it, a resemblance of that Kazakh, that men's house. and it wasn't elaborate at all. It was just they'd somehow put wire up and hung it from the ceiling, and then basically just used long, like brown paper. I suppose it's paper, I don't know, but and to my eyes, and yet one of the women who was an elder who told me about it when I was up there later, she said, we were stunned and couldn't move, and we were so deeply moved that we were going to hold this meeting in the Kaziak. I thought, you recognize that as a Kaziak when you walked in? To look at the photo, I was like, what's this? A circus tent? I don't get it.
Yeah.
It's just a story, but it moved me then and still moves me now. That recognition was so immediate, and all that was in it was metal folding chairs, right? But the whole thing had that feel. I think it was simply the shape of it, like just on a most elemental level of the circle, etc., with a ceiling that it changed the flat and the rectangular, because for the Yupiks and for so many other Native peoples, everything, the fundamental symbol is the circle, right? And they recounted to me, I wasn't looking for this story, they recounted to me how that set a whole possibility of conversation that otherwise wouldn't have happened. They were convinced. It's just a story and an example, but it's an effort. And I think I'm grateful to the generation of not many of them, but the priests and sisters who worked up in Alaska, that some of them saw their way to that. And when they had other failed efforts in previous decades, like we should have drumming in church, that was no across the board from everybody. The Yupik people, no. And they had to learn why. Why do these not meet or mix? And that's a longer story. But they found a way over a couple decades to reach the point of that meeting. And the key thing about that meeting was they were down to, when I was there in 81, 82, there were in Alaska almost 30 Jesuits working. There are now 4. And the youngest is in his 60s. So they were already planning, when this special meeting that was so moving happened, successful, when they were doing this back in the 1990s, a couple decades ago, it was a crucial meeting to say, how better can we help you people in the villages to take on the entire leadership and life of your churches? And to have done it in that shaped of a space, I learned from them, it was the physical, it was that very physical arrangement that made people feel at peace and ready to talk about these really difficult things. So it's just a story, but it's an example. Our order, the Jesuit order, has been quite. We've been good at getting in trouble over 480 years, and one of the other big times we got in big trouble was in our first century of work in the 16th century, was called the Chinese Rites controversy. And it was that the Jesuits had made their way into China, and they were adapting all the customs and practices of Roman, I guess you call it by then, Roman Catholicism, into a Chinese idiom, Chinese style, including that the priests dressed as mandarins, because it made sense that that's what an elder is. When you think about it, a priest is a presbyter, and what that means is elder. Just to give one little example, but it was quite thoroughgoing, and including they reworked all the rituals from baptism out. It turns out that men, I don't even want to say which, it's just so ironic I say it, the Franciscans thought that this was beyond the pale and in fact evil and unjust and everything, and they went back to Rome and made this cause of it. And ultimately, Rome decided against this entire Chinese rites program, if you will, or method of the Jesuits, and completely nullified it, and also to remove the Jesuits from working in those regions. So there's always conflict and the ironies in this and everything, right? But it's a struggle. I mean, it really is. And in the end of the day, it's because also all of these things, it's going to sound so trite, but I got to say, I mean, all these things bear great, great power. You know, they really do. And again, a lot of people in our late modern culture think there's no power in this stuff. Power would be money. Power, you know, you can think of a lot of other things that we would now identify most immediately, maybe practically with power. But the fact is, if people can have such strong reactions and have to hold meetings like this, etc., how ironic. The joke's on late modern people who think that all we need is this, and this has got nothing to do with it.